like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Our exciting adventures and boldest endeavors have not yet begun. My fellow Americans, for our movement, for our children, and for our beloved country. And I say this, despite all that's happened, the best is yet to come. So we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and give. The Democrats are hopeless. They're never voting for anything. Not even one vote. But we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help. We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to thank you all. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you all for being here. This is incredible. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, I'll spare you the Village people. I don't know why the Village people. I never got that part. All right, so let me say a few things, and I can have people, if they want, they can raise their hands. The context was this. This was January 6, 2020, about 2 weeks ago. Feels like a lifetime ago. And the Senate was meeting to count the electoral votes from the various states. The president is telling people that this fraudulent, that it counts fraudulent. He wants people to protest and walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, which is the street that goes from the White House down to the Capitol. It's about a 1.5 mile distance, maybe about a 30, 40-minute walk. And he wants them to give support to the strong Republicans and also to give the weak Republicans, which is his Vice President Pence, to sort of do what he wants to do. We all know what happened after it, right? You've seen the videos 100 times. People, rioters, insurrectionists, call them whatever you want, broke into the Capitol, knocked down windows, knocked down doors. They defaced property. They went into the House chamber. They went to the Senate chamber. They stole laptops. They took selfies in the speaker chair with the Viking hat. It's surreal to even be talking this as if it's class, but this is what happened. And a lot of those people were charged with crimes, property crimes, but there's some other crimes perhaps. Trump didn't walk. He was supposed to walk with them. He never actually did, which is not surprising. He stayed behind watching on TV. But my question is this, and I see Joe's first in the queue. You're welcome to raise your hand after that. Can this speech be criminally punished? In other words, is this speech the sort of thing that should be punished in in our criminal justice system? All right, Joe, your hand was up first. I'll be happy to call on you.
I think based on direct evidence, if you just base it solely on that speech, I think you'd have a hard time prosecuting it. I think if you use it as circumstantial evidence in a larger context, you take in the trial by combat, all of the things leading up to that. Look, I know drug dealers that have been prosecuted on RICO charges for a lot less. You know what I'm saying? A guy connects another dude on a phone call. They do a drug deal. Federal government alleges RICO, and everybody goes to jail for 20 years.
So let me ask you a question. I'll get to Nancy in a minute. Joe, I want to ask you a question. And we read a couple of cases today. We read from Justice Holmes, we read Schenck, we read Debs, we read Abrams. Let me ask you, under the standard from Schenck.
Under Schenck, I think you got him. I think there's a clear and present danger. You got an angry mob. He's well aware of that. And you, timing And context is everything. And I think at the time you did what you did, you basically presented a clear. I mean, look what happened. It's obviously a clear and present danger. I mean, you know.
So your position, Joe, is right, is that this would be the clear and present danger. That this is speech that would likely lead to some sort of violence. You think so?
No question. But and he's just clever enough to try to. You know what I mean? Like he skirts up to the edge, but if I were the prosecuting attorney trying to get him, that's what I would allege. I mean, that's what I would say. You got a clear and present danger. You got an angry mob. Look, they're there.
Yeah.
They're there under the auspice that the election has been stolen. They're there to stop the steal. And I'm sure they're chanting that. And so you give them any red meat. Yeah,
and I think you said this, I want to make sure people heard you. Trump is very careful with what he says. He knows where the line is. He didn't say go down Pennsylvania Avenue and break into the Capitol and smash windows and break in. He just said walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. And I can give you other parts. He even said walk down patriotically and peacefully. So the harder part is he says one thing and the crowd may take another message. In other words, the words said are not the entire message being conveyed. I think that's what you were sort of getting at. Like you can be very subtle. I think that's what you're getting at.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that, Joe. Okay. I see Nancy, Cassidy, and Bella on the queue. Nancy, go ahead.
Well, I'll gladly stand as Joe's co-counsel to get him, but I think that the struggle is going to be showing intent, right? He did, in fact, incite this mob. I know that there's arguments that this was already planned, and so he wasn't inciting anything. I think he did, in fact, incite that. But if you can't show that that was his intent, then can you find him guilty?
So under the Schenck standard, which we'll get to in a minute, I promise, does the speaker's intent matter? In other words, under the Holmes standard, the very first case that we assigned for today, does the speaker's intent matter, or is this sort of an objective standard looking on the outside?
I guess it's just objective, right? But as we move forward, we start talking about intent.
In other words, do we judge the speech based on the recording, or do we have to sort of figure out what Trump intended by maybe examining him or asking him questions? Like, that's my question to you. I think Marcus
under Schenck.
Yeah, I think Marcus put the answer in the chat. Marcus, what would you write in the chat? Just bring it up forward.
Yeah, I think we judge based off the effect on the community or on whoever hears it.
Right. So the likely effect, I think, is what you're getting at, right? Yeah. I think Emma says it's the speech's tendency to lead to the breaking of the law. So Nancy, does it matter what he intended in this case? Thanks, Marcus.
No, based on what you guys are saying, no.
All right.
No better than to answer a question you asked if I'm not fully prepared. But
no, it's okay.
Isn't there other cases?
Oh, there are other cases. Aren't there
other cases that we've read that said that they have to also intend?
I am only in 1917. I'm not asking present day. I want to ask you guys. I think that was a question I posed, right?
That's my computer. Okay.
Good. All right, Cassie, go ahead, and then Bella's next.
Yeah, I mean, I think that based on the cases that we read today, we would have him for a criminal charge because, I mean, they also focused heavily on the fact that the cases that we read today, it was during war.
Oh, so
he went up right before or earlier during that same rally and said that we were going to have was it trial by combat?
I think that was Giuliani, but yeah, it was in the same event.
It was the same event. And I think that all of the circumstances of that day, like turning to the Trump speech would point to guilty, or we would have at least grounds to have a prosecution.
All right. Thanks, Cassie. You got Bella next.
Yeah, I just wanted to further that with the idea of the circumstance. Even if he never used words like fight, or even if there was no call to action whatsoever, I think the idea of who he is and who he represents, as well as I think an established idea of like the idea that like the votes are fake and like that we should like take back our government is like clearly established well enough that regardless of what he had said, the circumstance points towards something. And his like power over the people there, I think, points also to the fact that there was going to be an effect.
Okay, very, very good. Thank you for that, Bella. All right, I see Micah, and then I'll move on. One more comment. So Micah, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say that I think based upon how he has spoken about protesting and rioting in the past in terms of peace and law and order and things like that, I think that you kind of have to be stupid to think that he was telling you to go destroy property when this march was planned for months and people kind of can take what they want from that. And I don't necessarily think that him saying, let's go cheer on people and do all of these things was kind of a message that he has been sending for his entire.
So you're saying statements made before January 6th might also be relevant. That's not just what he said there, but stuff that led up to it. Even weeks and months, even tweets. What about the tweets in advance of it? If the president tweeted, it's going to be wild. It's going to be wild. Would that be relevant? There was no tweeting in 1917, but a telegram, I don't know.
And I don't think necessarily that the Senate or Congress voting on something is necessarily equivalent or similar enough to times of war that that would be considered appropriate circumstances to actually convict him of doing something like this.
All right. Thanks, Micah. All right. Now let me change up the hypo, right? We've been talking here about President Trump saying that the election was rigged, it was fraudulent, and the votes cast by these states were not valid, right? We know the allegations. I don't need to go through them. Now, instead of, let's change President Trump to Eugene Debs for a minute. And let's change opposition to the election to opposition to the draft. Okay? See what I'm doing here, right? And you have a person, his name is Eugene Debs. He actually ran for president, I think, 4 times. He lost all of them. But this was a very prominent person who had a very large following, a relatively large following. He was a socialist, and he argued vigorously that the American draft was unconstitutional, which is a non-frivolous position. I think there are people today who agree with that, that the draft is a 13th Amendment violation. It's a form of involuntary servitude. But put that aside for now. He argued that the draft was unconstitutional. And he urged people to resist the draft, not to register, not to report, to fight the draft. Right? That action would put American lives in jeopardy. Right? We were in the middle of a war. World War I. It wasn't called World War I back then, but it was a huge war. People were dying, and the American government needed it. And the government sincerely felt that if Eugene Debs went around giving speeches telling people to resist the draft and not register for the draft and to fight it and not be recruited, Americans would die. Right? So what happens here? I want to just draw similarities and we can distinguish in a minute. But in both cases, you have prominent politicians advancing legal-ish arguments. And again, I think Trump's arguments were completely specious, they're completely false, but let's just put aside for a minute. People are allowed to hold false political views. They're terrible ideas. People have false views. How eager should we be for the government to punish people who are criticizing or challenging the legality of established policies? I think it's very easy to dump on Trump, and I guess that rhymes, with respect to the insurrection at the Capitol last week or 2 weeks ago. But the principles there are very different. In other words, the test put forward in Schenck and Debs, perhaps not Abrams, but at least in Schenck and Debs, erred on the side of government control. That is, the state should have the discretion, the leeway, the presumption that it can punish speech that frustrates the government. And then later we see cases where Holmes is in dissent, where he says, maybe that's not such a good idea, right? Maybe this sort of reminds us of the Sedition Act of 1798 with the Adams administration. In other words, if Trump, he was a private citizen, forget the president for a minute. If a private citizen Trump, right? If private citizen Trump is able to be punished for the speech, what else do we have, right? Who else is able to be punished? All right. I leave it out there. If anyone wants to comment on this point, or we can go to the cases. I don't have a strong preference.
What was the question again, Professor?
I don't know. I think the question is, how much should we be willing to give the government the power to punish those criticizing the government? In other words, if Trump can be punished for his speech, where does that lead? We forget slippery slope, but where does it lead for the government to be able to throw people in jail, not for breaking in? If they break in, that's fine. I'm with them. But the person who perhaps motivates them to break in because of a legal argument. All right, I see Shelby, I see Blake, and maybe I'll do one other, and then we'll go into the cases. Shelby, go ahead.
I mean, I think you're just setting a dangerous precedent when you are punishing people for speaking out against the government, when that is kind of the foundation and roots of our country, is being able to speak out against government oppression. And even in these cases, when it's people who are going against, the democratic form of government, their socialist, communist arguments, as much as I disagree with those, it's hard for me to say that we should allow the government to punish that form of speech.
Shelby, let me give you another example. Let's say this wasn't 2020. Let's say this was the year 2000. We had the election of Bush v. Gore, right? I'm sure you've read about it. And you had a really close election. This wasn't like 5 states this was 1 state. And we're talking about, a couple thousand votes. And let's say the facts where the Supreme Court got the case wrong. People think Bush v. Gore was wrongly decided. What if Al Gore said on the steps of the White House, outside the White House, the Supreme Court got this wrong. I'm the president. The Supreme Court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment was absolutely wrong. And you should march to the Supreme Court to protest. And then people march there and start, breaking the doors and this other stuff, right? Would Gore's speech stand, again, assuming he had a good legal argument, could he be then punished for incitement? Should he?
I don't think he should. I think the people who committed acts that are illegal, who come in and destroy, deface property, absolutely should be punished. But if you're just calling for peaceful protest,
so then
it's
question,
hard to delineate that line.
How do we know what's peaceful, right? Okay, I got Blake and Calvin, and after that, so I'm going to need to move on because I want to cover the cases. So Blake, go ahead, then Calvin.
You had asked if private citizen Trump was to be punished for what he said, who else would be punished? And you could go to many people on Facebook, almost anybody on Parler, and start prosecuting from that point of view. But, we look at the different tests of the bad tendency test, or whether or not there's imminent or likelihood to incite actual violence. I kind of thought of a metaphor a few minutes ago. It's like, if you know that there's a raging fire, you might not be starting the fire, but when you pour gasoline on it just by leading people to believe that you support it, is that crossing that fine line of actually inciting it?
Yeah, this issue of incitement is very difficult, right? And I'll put it this way. If you're a good public speaker, you can read a room, you can read a crowd, and you know which way they're leaning, right? And you don't need to say what you're actually saying. You can say something else and get the same message across. I am no demagogue. Maybe I'll be a demagogue later in life, but I'm not one yet. But at least I know when I have a class, not Zoom with 100 freaking squares, but with actual human beings in front of me, I know which way a class is leaning, and I could tweak it without saying it, and I can sort of dance around it. So good speakers, Eugene Debs or anyone else, can do it. They know that line. All right, Calvin, last comment, then we want to move on.
Well, I just wanted to say briefly, it strikes me that there's a lot of sort of after the fact thinking going on here.
Good.
A lot of justification seems to be that because a bad end occurred, we can therefore retroactively infer a certain amount of intent or of danger after the fact, which I don't think seems entirely fair. We're imputing a lot of foreseeability into the motives and potential actions.
That's good.
Thousands of people.
Yes.
And I just don't know that that step is entirely justified without some more evidence.
In other words, let's say Trump gave the same speech and then those thousands of people walked to the Capitol and just marched peacefully, protest and started screaming at him and they went home.
Exactly, in accordance with the actual words that he spoke.
Right, which is why the question I gave to Nancy before, what's the standard? Is it based on Trump's intent? Is it objective? I think Marcus came in and said, what's the likely effect, right? Under the Holmes standard, it's what likely is going to happen. It's almost like an attempted murder. It's like you shot the person, but you didn't succeed because you didn't die, right? It's like one of those things in crim law, right? It's if you have speech or likely incite an intent, and let's say it starts raining really hard, so they, oh man, it's raining, I want to go home, right? Or a blizzard comes along and they can't finish it. Or like there's an earthquake and they can't cross Pennsylvania Avenue. Right? I'm just making stuff up. But you raise a fair point, is how much do we factor in the ultimate effect? In the Debs and Schenck cases, nothing actually happened. These were just speeches, but here we know it happened because it was tweeted and live streamed and everyone taking selfies in the speaker's chair, right? I need a Viking hat for my last day of class. Okay, I'll put the war paints on and the pelt. All right, I do want to call on people. We have 20 minutes left to do some of the cases. Let's try this. Let me summarize a bit the cases, and I'll call on someone. Who's next, just so I know where I am in the queue? Does anyone even know? Well, you have to remember. I know I called on Cassidy. Okay, I'll call on you, Cassidy. I think you were around the.
You were close to me, but I don't know where you were in the list.
Okay, Laura, you're up. Oh, Bella, I'll call on you next, Bella. All right, so let's do these two cases together, the first two, because I think it might make this process a little bit simpler. During World War I, President Wilson enacted the Espionage Act, which more or less gave the government the power to punish speech. If you actually engage in an act of violence, for example, you put a bomb inside of a recruiting office, or you try to, beat up a military recruiting officer, you can be punished for a crime. But this was designed for speech. People distributed pamphlets, right? People put out flyers, pieces of paper, right? So we have Schenck. And Schenck put out pamphlets in the mails that oppose the draft, the military draft. And they said that the draft is a form of slavery. It's conscription. It's unconstitutional, which again is not a trivial position. There are a lot of people who argue this throughout American history. To this day, people argue it. He was prosecuted for basically sending letters in the mail, pamphlets in the mail. Okay, so Bella, here's your question. Holmes puts forward this test, which is known as the bad tendency test. Okay, he says we can punish speech based on the circumstances. Okay, and he says, is the natural tendency of the publication to produce violence? So Bella, my question is, what does this mean? Is a natural tendency to produce violence? What is that getting at?
I wouldn't necessarily, specifically the case of Schenck and maybe Debs, I wouldn't say that there was ever, I guess, a chance.
Oh, no, just in general, not just, what does that phrase mean, natural tendency? What's that mean, natural tendency? Just in the abstract, without regard to this case. That
without it, that there wouldn't be violence.
Is this like a but for? I'm trying to pin down exactly where you're coming from here.
It could be a but for, but maybe more that it's intended effect, or it's.
What about reckless? What if I do something recklessly? We're going back to no criminal law. I'm sorry, but this is relevant. What if my intent is one of recklessness? It's not purposeful. It's not intentional. It's just reckless.
with regard to the high probability.
Is that enough for a natural tendency?
I think so. If
What-
the tendency.
What about negligent? What if I negligently engage in this speech? Is that enough?
I think that is closer to 50-50, so maybe the effect isn't so strong.
So I see in the chat, which I'll try to bring forward, Emma's having flashbacks to Rapes Locator. I'm sorry. Christina says foreseeable. Marcus says inherently the speech creates the danger. Yeah, but inherently kind of jumps over the mens rea element. So I think there is some sort of mens rea element, but it's an objective standard. It's not based on what the speaker himself intended. It's looking at the speech. What is the likely foreseeable consequence? And it's hard to decide, right? I think what the court's basically saying is if it's probable, if it's possible, I think it's 51%. I think it's what Bella said. Maybe it's 51%. That's enough. I don't know if it's even that high. But the court puts forward this bad tendency test, right? That if you engage in speech that has a possible tendency to lead to violence, then that speech can be punished. Now, that could be violence today, violence tomorrow, violence 5 years from now. You know, you're mailing letters that have to go through the mail. Someone's to open the envelope, read the damn thing. Oh, man, you know what? I'm going to read this and I'm going to do some violence. There's a lot of attenuation, a lot of gap between the statement, excuse me, and violence. All right, thanks, Bella. I appreciate that. So now we have Debs, which decided right around the same time. Eugene Debs, I'm sorry, ran for president 5 times, not 4 times. I was wrong before. And he garnered, 5 or 6% of the electoral vote. I mean, that's non-trivial. That's a lot of votes. Okay. He was charged for obstructing the recruiting of the draft. And the court said, again, Justice Holmes, that he was encouraging frustrating government functions, right? The court says that Debs should have known that his words would have that effect. So again, it's sort of an objective standard. It's either he knew or should have known. It's sort of vague, the exact mens rea. But again, the words have the likely effect. If you tell people the draft is unconstitutional, the likely effect is they will not participate with the draft. Everyone, I think, agree with that. I think that's the sort of reasoning. So again, Holmes says there's a natural tendency, this bad tendency of his speech. Okay, so everyone get Debs and Abrams. The facts are actually pretty simple. All right, Bella, who's next? Laura, I think you're next.
Hello.
Hi, Laura. Good to see you. All right, Laura, so let me ask you a question, please. We go into Abrams, right? In Schenck and Debs, Holmes wrote the majority. But when we get to the Abrams case, Holmes jumped off with Brandeis. I kind of look like Brandeis now. I think it's actually more Brandeis than Einstein. But Debs, in Abrams, Holmes jumps off. He's now in dissent with Brandeis. Why do you think that Holmes dissented in the Abrams case, but he was in the majority for the first two?
In the first two, there was specific acts that were being instructed to go out and do to participate in. And then in Abrams, he was saying how there wasn't the intent that was required, that it was just talking about not wanting to have the American presence in Russia, not to impede what they're actually doing.
Okay. So the actual speech at issue in Abrams was basically opposing American foreign policy in Russia, but let's all be honest for a minute. They were supporting the communists, right? This was after the Revolution of 17. They were supporting the USSR. Laura, would the speech of Abrams have the likely effect of harming American foreign policy?
Probably not.
You say probably not. Who's next? Alejandra here?
Hi, I'm here.
Okay, thanks, Alejandra. So Alejandro, we have this very famous phrase that Holmes came up with: "This clear and present danger." Right? It's clear, it's present. Is that the same thing as a natural tendency to lead to violence? In other words, clear and present seems like, oh my God, it's here. It's like immediate, like it's going to happen tomorrow, right? It's happening right now. Versus the tendency. Are these tests the same? This clear and present danger and this bad tendency, are they the same thing?
I don't think it's the same because one, like the clear and present one, is obviously present, so it's happening right now. You can see that
Imminent, right now, imminent, right?
Right. Whereas the other one is like it could be foreseeable in the future.
How far in the future?
Doesn't have to be necessarily right now.
At any point in the future?
That's how I understand it.
Let me ask you a question. When Trump gave that speech a couple weeks ago, he was at the White House lawn, about a mile and a half from the Capitol. It's about a 30, 40-minute walk if you check Google. Was there a clear and present danger when he gave that speech? Was it clear and present right now?
Well, I think that you said it was a 30 to 40-minute walk, so it's not that far into the future. So I would consider that as being clear and present.
So what if people change their mind after 34 minutes? Is there a cooling off period?
Well, I'm guessing if it were maybe a few years after the whole. Oh, okay, so I guess in this specific situation, it would be after the new president came into office.
So basically, there's a 2-week window, right?
Basically, for this specific scenario.
Okay.
If it were something different, like during the war, then it would probably be like after the war, because at that point, then it becomes smooth.
So basically, if you gave a speech, it might be a couple years where they could still incite violence, it's still clear and present.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
So you're willing to wait a couple years after a speech where you could still incite violence? You said after the war goes on for years.
I think it could be possible, but I think it would also take into consideration like the different actions that are occurring during it. Or for example, like if you're publishing the pamphlets and that's the way that you're giving out the information, if you continue doing it during that time frame, then I do think it would be valid.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Alejandra. So I think Holmes went through a bit of a transformation, and it's sort of outside the scope of the case. I don't like to get too far into it, but he was sort of taken by free speech. And I think he sort of came to regret his opinions in Schenck and Debs. People debate about this for decades. But he changed his mind. And he said, there is no present danger of immediate evil. Right? He says Congress cannot forbid all efforts to change people's minds. Right? Because really what these socialists were doing is they were challenging our government. They wanted a different government. Is there anything wrong with challenging our government? I mean, we have elections. People are socialists. They run for president, even today, right? I mean, is that inherently wrong to say that our system of governance is flawed, needs to be changed? In other words, where's the line between calling for revolution versus just calling for a new government? Our own Declaration of Independence were a bunch of insurrectionists. They threw Tina Harbor, and they start firing on their own soldiers, at Lexington and Concord. All right. So the rulings in Schenck and Debs and Abrams were the rule of the law for some time, but the Holmes dissent in Abrams set a different course. And Holmes comes up with this idea of the marketplace of ideas. It's a very famous concept. Right? He says the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. Right? In other words, why are you so afraid of speech? If this speech is persuading people, then maybe we should be hearing it. Let me say it differently. If the government wants to suppress a certain viewpoint, maybe that's because the government is afraid of that viewpoint. It's not just the hypothetical risks of violence, but it's that viewpoint could throw them out of power. And it's precisely because they're at risk of losing power, they enact these laws. Go back to John Adams, right? The Federalists had the Sedition Act to punish the Republicans who criticized their government. It's always going to be the case that those limiting speech are those who fear losing power. And those challenging the government are those who want to gain power. It's just that's an inherent aspect of government, right? It's those in power can punish, those out of power want to use their speech. Usually those who are the most vigorous free speech advocates are those who are the minority. And when those people get into the majority, they give up on free speech. It's the story of the world, right? It's for the longest time, free speech was more of a sort of an issue on the left, and now it's almost become reversed. It's conservatives screaming for free speech. Things have a funny way of reversing over times. Okay. Holmes also says that this is a theory of the Constitution. Now, if you had me for con law, you know I'm not a Holmes fan. I'm sort of an anti-Holmes fan. I think he's pretty overrated, almost as overrated as John Marshall. Not quite, but he's up there. But Holmes' most famous statement in Lochner, his Lochner dissent, is the Constitution does not enact Mr. Herbert Spencer's social statics. Right there is no economic theory of the Constitution. But here he's advocating for basically an economic theory of speech, or a marketplace of ideas. They're hard to line up. They're hard to reconcile. But Holmes just developed a preference for free speech. Not Lochner. I'm sorry. If you weren't in my common law class, you're lucky. But we did way too much on Lochner. Yes, Laura, go ahead.
So do you want us to focus more on calling it the bad tendency test or the clear and present danger?
Unfortunately, both. People call it the clear and present danger test, but if you were alive in the 1918s, you would call it the bad tendency test. In other words, the more historically accurate name is the bad tendency test, but over time, people started saying clear and present danger because it sounds better. So the answer is both. There was a good movie, I think it was a Tom Clancy book called Clear and Present Danger. Probably check on Netflix or something. I think it was Harrison Ford. It was Harrison, I'm sure. Anyway, all right. Oh, God, almost out of time. I hate this short. This class should be 2 hours. Whoever made, I'm sorry. The idea of this would be a 50-minute class is just nuts. It's terrible. All right. Any other questions on Schenck, Debs, or Abrams? There's a long question in the DM, direct messages. I can't do it right now. Come to office hours. Happy to answer it. Yeah, Macy, go ahead.
So for Abrams, the most important part of this is actually the dissent.
Historically, yeah, the majority, I think, sticks to the Schenck and Debs line. I don't think the majority deviates much, but it's a dissent that basically sets the stage of where the First Amendment will go. And that's a perfect segue to our next two cases, Gitlow and Stromberg. The 14th Amendment was enacted in 1868. At the time, those who drafted it thought that it would change things. The First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, First Aid Amendment, only limited federal power. But many of the people who wrote the 14th Amendment thought that now the federal government will be limited and the state government will be limited, right? It would take some time for the courts to come around. Initially, in cases like Bradwell v. Illinois, Crookshank, which is it's in your book, you can read it. The court said that the 14th Amendment did not extend the Bill of Rights to the states. But starting in the early 20th century, the court began to suggest that, well, maybe that's wrong. Gitlow is an important case. Because Gitlow sort of said, not so clearly, but it said that the states are now limited by the 14th Amendment and by the First Amendment. That was a huge deal. And then we get to Stromberg versus California. This was another speech case. You had a person waving a red flag. It was like, the Soviet flag. And he was punished for waving a red flag. Can you imagine? It'd be like a good exam question, punishing someone for wearing a red hat. Maybe that's the modern day version of that hypo. And the court actually declared, right, this California law unconstitutional as a violation of free speech. So two important things here. One, the court clearly held that the freedom of speech limits both the federal government and the state governments, right? From this point forward, the states were bound by the First Amendment. Second, I think Stromberg began to signal a departure from the Schenck-Debs line of cases. Right, the analysis in Stromberg was very short. It's a page or two. It's a short case. But what the court seemed to suggest is the government can't have these sort of very vague laws, right? These very vague laws that punish speech. that if the government wants to punish speech, they need to have a very factually specific charge, right? They need to show how the speech leads to violence. And merely waving a red flag is articulating a political viewpoint. Without more, it's not enough to get you to violence. You can see here how the court is sort of chipping away at the natural tendency test or the bad tendency test, right? With the bad tendency test, so long as it's possible that your speech may lead to violence, the government can punish it. Here, the court seems to be saying you need more than that. You need something more to show there's a link, a connection between your speech and violence. Another important point, this doesn't involve actual speech. Not words, not a printed pamphlet, not a speech, but a flag. How is a flag speech? How is using a symbol speech? Is waving a flag speech? Is burning an American flag speech? Ooh, we'll do that case later this semester. Is burning a cross speech? Ooh, we'll do that case also later this semester. So you're already seeing the court in the 1930s begin to develop its First Amendment body of case law, right? Schenck and Debs are still law, good law, and they will be till the 1960s. We'll do the next class when they overrule Schenck and Debs. But here they're starting to say, wait a minute, this is not such a good idea. People need to be able to speak critically of the government, and the government can't use these sort of very vague and ambiguous laws to sweep in a large amount of speech. All right, I got about 2 minutes left, and I'm happy to say afterwards, questions from the students. Okay, Denver, I see your hand's up.
I was going to say something. The little excerpt they give, I think it's in Debs, of one of his speeches where he's like, he makes a reference to cannon fodder. It kind of reminded me of The Great Dictator. You know, at the end, Charlie Chaplin makes that speech. I wonder if he was an influence for that.
You know, that's on my HBO Max playlist. I've not watched it yet, but I will get to it.
Good one. Good one.
Okay. Cannon fodder, if you don't get the reference, is people basically stand from the cannon to be shot. That's the reference. All right. Other questions? Yes, Micah, go ahead. Is it Micah or Mika? How do you say your name?
Mika.
Mika, go ahead.
So to my understanding, in the Declaration of Independence, it talks about if the people feel that one of their inalienable rights is being restricted or whatever, that they can lawfully overthrow the government. And I noticed a lot of the cases mention that the defendants in these cases were trying to overthrow the government unlawfully. So I guess what I'm asking is kind of under what circumstances, because I know in today's current political climate, the right is kind of the mindset that their free speech is being restricted or repressed or whatever. So is there an argument in the sense that kind of there's a justification for that? Not that I'm saying that it was justified, but could you say that their rights were being restricted? I guess.
I think I see where you're going with this. I see Ryan has a question afterwards. If you need to leave, you're welcome to sign off. I do want to answer this question in the next one. When we're by the way, I forgot to do it last class. I promise to answer your question, Micah. I always use the iClicker to what I call the minute poll. This is a short 1 minute poll. There's no question. It's just I want you to type whatever you think is your takeaway from the class or any questions. This is your way of communicating to me. So I'm going to start the poll now. It'll take you just a minute and short answer, but just tell me what you're thinking, what you learned today, questions. I'm happy to get to it. So Micah, I'd encourage you, if you can, to go back to my common law class and watch the very first day where I talk about the Declaration. Right. One person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. Right. In American history and throughout the world, those who are called revolutionaries may be called terrorists by others. There's a very fine line between them. Is it possible to lawfully overthrow a government? Usually not. There are very few governments overthrown without bloodshed. And And I think the socialists thought that the United States government was inherently corrupt and had to be taken down the same way the Russian government was, where they slaughtered the entire Russian aristocracy. You ever see the movie Anastasia? That they were all killed. I don't know what a lawful revolution is. There's not a good answer to that, which is why I think the court has moved away from the Holmes standard. If you have socialists who are convinced that our society is corrupt and needs to be destroyed, maybe they're right. Maybe their view should be heard. And maybe they can persuade people to vote for a socialist for president or not. But I think what the Holmes's dissent is getting at is let that view be argued out in the marketplace and not shut down by a government prosecution. Does that sort of answer your question, Micah?
Yeah.
Okay, I hope so. Okay, Ryan, go ahead, and then we'll wrap up after that.
Mine was just sort of a summarizing question, and I guess the poll sort of takes that place. So I was just wondering, so we're looking at a bad tendency test, clear and present danger test, two ways of saying similar things, but not the exact same thing. The clear and present danger is focused more on the imminence. Bad tendency is the natural consequences. These things have, it's measured on an objective intent basis, so what an objective, reasonable person would think the intent of the speech was. And then these developed in the 20s, held up through the were chipped away. And then as we get into like Brandenburg and things in the 60s, that's when we start changing the standard to be more of the two-part test.
Yeah, we'll do Brandenburg next class, I promise.
Okay.
Very good summary. Okay. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much for that. That was an excellent class. And if we handled that more responsibly than I thought you would, which is good. I never know these things work, but that worked okay. All right, everyone. See you all on Monday and have a wonderful weekend. Office hours, about 10 or 15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you.